Anyone from the house of Israel or from the foreigners who live among them who eats any blood, I will turn against that person who eats blood and cut him off from his people. For the life of a creature is in the blood, and I have appointed it to you to make atonement on the altar for your lives, since it is the lifeblood that makes atonement. Therefore I say to the Israelites, none of you and no foreigner who lives among you may eat blood. Any Israelite or foreigner living among them who hunts down a wild animal or bird that may be eaten must drain its blood and cover it with dirt, since the life of every creature is its blood. I have told the Israelites, you must not eat the blood of any creature, because the life of every creature is its blood. Whoever eats it must be cut off. If you've watched any of the cooking shows on Food Network, you've probably seen things like black pudding or blood sausage. These dishes are popular in Ireland and Great Britain, and they use animal blood in the recipe. Any dish or drink that contains the blood of a clean or unclean animal is prohibited by Yahweh. Here's a video showing an example of how people in our day cook with blood, in case you may not be aware of this.
Where I'm from, in Quebec, growing up, I would eat blood sausage for breakfast, but it was terrible. I remember growing up, like the blood was like too cooked, crumbly. It was not something very enjoyable. You know, I found out that it's possible to have it good and creamy. I've been fascinated by that, and it's also a great way to thicken sauces. If you think about that, you could use blood just as you would use egg yolks.
If it's not in a sausage, I don't know how to cook with blood, but just giving the kind of tip of treat it like an egg yolk makes it a lot more accessible, just like kind of automatically. I guess is how you approach it. This has cultural and a history, Right? It's not like you're just like, you know, making buttermilk pancakes with blood in them just because you can or anything like that. This was created for a reason, and it was like you were saying, like you have the whole animal. It's the first thing you get to have because it's the freshest and it doesn't last that long.
And also you had to because like the blood doesn't last forever and stuff. It would go. They had to. You know, this like
use it right away, yeah.
We're gonna get the rabbit cooking. This time being, we're gonna use pork blood, which is like perhaps the creamiest you can get. Okay. You know, when you go with like cow blood or even goat. Goat is very delicious as well, but like it's drier. I think like most people could never find raw chicken blood. I happen to have like a friend that has a halal slaughterhouse. This is it. So you have a part that's coagulated, and you have a part that like it's almost like water, you know. So like it separates like this. I'm gonna blend it again, this so we can work the garnish better and stuff, and we can pour it more evenly. I'm just gonna put a little vinegar.
Okay. Red wine vinegar, right?
Red wine vinegar.
And the vinegar is what uncoagulates it, right? Yeah. That color is amazing. Oh, can we try that a little bit?
Yeah, and so you'll see it's not the same.
That tastes like blood.
Yeah.
We came here with the question, how do we use blood? Yeah. Like, is it worth using? How to use it the best way? I think you just gave us like 3 shining examples of how to use blood. It is not just like a part of the dish or an element of the dish, it's what makes the dish. These are all fantastic. Thank you so much for having us.
Some people make the point that it is impossible to remove every drop of blood from an animal in slaughtering, and that is correct. I watched a video this past week that I would have loved to show in this lesson, but it's in a foreign language. I believe it was Dutch, and it had subtitles, and so you can look it up, where on YouTube there's a video that shows how a man interested in the Jewish tradition of koshering meat, he found out that number 1, it is impossible to remove all traces of blood from animal meat, and number 2, there is little difference in the amount of blood in animal meat that has been slaughtered and salted in the rabbinical koshering methods versus an animal that is slaughtered by a non-kosher butcher. In other words, it is standard practice to drain the blood of an animal when slaughtering. I agree with this man's conclusions. I do not believe that Yahweh is forbidding his people from eating a medium cooked steak or even a rare cooked steak, but instead Yahweh is forbidding the eating or drinking, which is the consumption, of the blood of an animal that pours out when an animal is slaughtered and hung to drain. Notice again, Leviticus 17:13 says that when you hunt and kill an animal, which in ancient times would have been done only with a bow and arrow, you can see Genesis 27:1-4, where Isaac instructs Esau. When this is done, you must drain the animal's blood and cover it with dirt. Deuteronomy 12:15-16 and verses 23-25 helps us understand this as well. But whenever you want, you may slaughter and eat meat within any of your gates, according to the blessing Yahweh your mighty one has given you. Those who are clean or unclean may eat it, as they would a gazelle or a deer. Take note that the clean and unclean there in verse 15 is referring to people, a person who is ceremonially clean or ceremonially unclean. A ceremonially unclean person was not permitted to eat of formal sacrifices to Yahweh, the ones that were edible for them or could be edible for them, but they were allowed to eat meat in their gates that had been slaughtered. Verse 16, but you must not eat the blood. Pour it out on the ground like water. But don't eat the blood. This is verse 23, since the blood is the life, and you must not eat the life with the meat. Do not eat the blood. Pour it on the ground like water. Do not eat it so that you and your children after you will prosper, because you will be doing what is right in Yahweh's sight. The Torah is telling us that the blood that shouldn't be eaten is the blood that is poured out on the ground like water. It's this blood that is the life of the animal. The animal loses its life when this blood is shed. It helps here to have slaughtered an animal before. Now, I haven't slaughtered as many as a butcher or someone who is in charge of slaughtering animals at a slaughterhouse, but in the past 20 plus years, I've slaughtered probably around 30 or more sheep and goats, most of them for Passover and some of them for just general meat purposes. Well, when you slaughter a sheep or a goat by slitting its throat at the jugular vein, the blood of the animal immediately pours out of the animal and onto the ground like water, just as Yahweh says in the Torah. And in my experience, when you do this properly, the animal dies in 2 to 5 minutes when its lifeblood leaves. And when you hang the animal after that to skin it, you have a little more blood trickle or drain out, but nothing like the initial slaughter. This is the blood that is not to be consumed, because the blood is the life of the animal. And there is no mention anywhere in the written Torah about the rabbinical Jewish method of slaughter, which is called shechita, or the salting of the meat, or the removing of certain blood vessels on the animal. All of that is tradition, and it's not mentioned in Yahweh's written law. The technical modern scientific name for this blood is the hemoglobin. Hemoglobin contains the breath of life. That's what is being removed from the animal when slaughtered. Now, there is also a protein that stores oxygen in the muscle cells of an animal. It is embedded in the muscle tissue, and that is called myoglobin. Myoglobin is what causes the meat to continue its red color even after the hemoglobin in the animal has been removed. It is impossible to remove the myoglobin from animal meat. It cannot be poured out on the ground as water like the hemoglobin can.
It's kind of unavoidable. If you cut into a big, juicy, rare steak, you're gonna get some juice. Watery red liquid seeps out of the meat and onto the plate, and it kind of looks like blood. But I have good news for people who like to eat red meat, but don't like to eat blood. It's not blood, it's just water, plus a handy protein called myoglobin. All meat is muscle, but the muscle looks different depending on what it's used for. White meats like turkey and chicken come from muscles that are used in short spurts every so often, but have to get moving quickly. Think of a chicken breast. they don't actually use their wings very often. Red meats, like beef, lamb, and even pork, come from muscles used for long, strenuous activities, like carrying a huge cow around all the time. Before cooking, these meats are a pinky reddish color. Holding up a heavy cow is some serious work that requires a lot of oxygen for fuel, which is where myoglobin comes in. Myoglobin is a special protein with an iron atom at its center, which bonds with, then stores and delivers oxygen to muscle cells. It works together with hemoglobin, another oxygen carrier, to get oxygen to the cells that need it. The difference between red meat and white meat comes from the levels of myoglobin in the muscle. The myoglobin protein itself is red, so the more myoglobin in the cells, the redder the meat appears. And that juice that's spilling out of your meat, that's a combination of water and myoglobin. The animal's blood was removed when the meat was processed. Beef is around 0.8% myoglobin, and lamb has a little less at 0.6%. And all of those ads have been lying to you, because at 0.2% myoglobin, pork is generally considered red meat too. Chicken only has about a quarter of that amount. But what about humans? Well, our flesh is about as red meat can get, at 2% myoglobin. If you happen to like steak but you don't want red juice, you have options. Myoglobin is red when it's bonded with oxygen. When meat is cooked rare, up to about 60 degrees Celsius, the color stays. Above that temperature, the iron atom in myoglobin loses an electron and therefore its ability to bind with oxygen. Instead, the myoglobin forms a new molecule called hemochrome that gives medium and well-done meat its brown-gray color. Myoglobin will also turn brown if it's exposed to air for long enough, because that makes the iron atoms lose an electron too, which is why checking the color can be a handy way to tell if your store-bought meat is still fresh. It doesn't always work though, because some meat producers add compounds that keep the meat red, and the color can last way past the expiration date. But if you do end up buying that red meat and cooking it rare, I hope you enjoy your oxygen-rich protein water. Thanks for asking, and thanks especially to all of our patrons on Patreon who keep these answers coming. If you'd like to submit questions to be answered, or get these quick questions a few days before everyone else, go to patreon.com/scishow. And don't forget to go to youtube.com/scishow and subscribe.
Going back to Leviticus 17, this explains why we aren't to eat an animal that died of itself or was mauled by a wild animal. In Leviticus 17:15, we read, "Every person, whether the native or the foreigner, who eats an animal that died a natural death or was mauled by wild beasts, is to wash his clothes and bathe in water, and he will remain unclean until evening." Now, I think what's taking place here is an unintentional eating, or an eating in ignorance. In other words, you shouldn't eat it, but in a case where, one, you ate such an animal but didn't realize it, or two, you ate it out of necessity, you had to bathe and wash your clothes upon finding out. Now, the reason I believe this is because Exodus chapter 22, verse 31 says, "Be my holy people, you must not eat the meat of a mauled animal found in the field, throw it to the dogs." Deuteronomy 14:21 says, "You are not to eat any carcass. You may give it to a resident alien within your gates, and he may eat it. Or you may sell it to a foreigner, for you are a holy people belonging to Yahweh." Now, the difference, I believe, between the foreigner here in Deuteronomy 14:21 and the foreigner in Leviticus 17:10-16 is that one had joined the nation of Israel to serve Yahweh and keep his commandments, and the other one had not. So, back to the point of the law, I believe that clean animals that died of themselves without being slaughtered, or died by being mauled in the field, they still had a large amount of blood, hemoglobin, in their body. An animal that dies in either of those ways will probably not be found until the next day by the owner. I've checked on animals one day and then found them dead the next day. Sometimes they were sick, sometimes they had been mauled. Either way, that animal was not slaughtered, and thus the blood was not poured out on the ground like water. I believe this is what is meant later on in the Bible at the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15, when the elders at Jerusalem decided that the Gentile converts, people from non-covenant nations or heathen nations who were turning to Yahweh, had to begin observing certain laws upon their conversion. Two of those laws were that the Gentiles had to abstain from things strangled and blood. And this lesson has helped us to understand that these two laws actually group together. Therefore, in my judgment, we should not cause difficulties for those among the Gentiles who turn to the Mighty One, but instead we should write to them to abstain from things polluted by idols, from sexual immorality, from eating anything that has been strangled, and from blood. For since ancient times Moses has had those who proclaim him in every city, and every Sabbath day he is read aloud in the synagogues. Gentiles were steeped in all sorts of idolatry. Many of their customs included the eating of the blood of the sacrifices to their false mighty ones while engaging in temple prostitution. We see here how important the command to not eat the blood is, because it is one of the first customs the Gentile converts were required to stop doing, right along with sexual immorality and idol worship. As verse 21 tells us, the law of Moses would be proclaimed aloud in the synagogues on the Sabbath day. It had been done so since ancient times. And the Gentiles would learn and they would grow in the Torah as they heard the law being read and expounded on each Sabbath day. Right here at their start, though, they had to stop these detestable practices centered around their heathen temple worship.